Hello, everybody, ladies, gentlemen, and otherwise. Welcome to part 2 of my Hamilton talks. So, yeah, if you are watching this or listening to this, I'm assuming that you've already listened to the first part, so we can get straight into the beginning of Act 2 with the opening song, What Did I Miss? Another very popular one. We get a really nice introduction to Act 2 that follows the same melody as Alexander Hamilton, as well as the same setup with Aaron Burr being like, how does it do? But it is developed further. The piano in the song is also playing the whoa whoa whoas of My Shot. I think there's some extra layers on there as well, but it all shows how Hamilton has developed and grown ever since the beginning of Act 1. It's a really nice melody. I love it. I kind of wish it lasted longer, to be honest. Anyway, we are introduced to Thomas Jefferson. You might have heard of him. Where was he during Act 1? Well, he was serving as the ambassador in France during the war, and at this point he's come back to America and is just like, hey guys, what I miss? And everyone else has got to be like, so, we kind of burnt the Britain Bridge. We're now our own country. And, Washington's now the new leader of our place. So, and he wants you to be the Secretary of State. So, that's cool. We are... also, it is worth mentioning, that... Well, Jefferson mentions how he helped out Lafayette with his independence issues, and then had to return to his home. This is their way of explaining why Lafayette's not around in the second act. Why is he not around in the second act? Well, because the actor playing Lafayette, Daveed Diggs, is currently playing Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, so this is something that's kind of unique with Hamilton. There are four actors rather, who are playing different characters. They play one character in the first act and then play a completely different character in the second act. What I mean by this is Daveed Diggs, for example, plays Lafayette in the first act, and then plays Thomas Jefferson in the second act. We also have Anthony Ramos, who plays John Lawrence in Act 1, and then plays, spoiler alert, Philip Hamilton in Act 2. We also get, I feel like I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, so I'm sorry in advance, but Okieriet Onaldoan, who plays Hercules Mulligan in Act 1, and then plays, James Madison. Why did I forget his name? Plays James Madison in the second act, who you already know. And then the last one is, Jasmine Cephas, Jones, who plays Peggy Schuyler in the first act, and then plays someone else in the second act, who we haven't actually seen yet. So, anyway, that's something that's rather unique. And I reckon it would actually be quite fun to play as, like, any of these characters, because you get to play two characters in one show. I'd say that's quite the bargain. Anyway, the song What Did I Miss is very upbeat and eccentric, very much like how Jefferson acts in this show. In a way, he's kind of similar to Hamilton over how outspoken the two of them are. Except I feel like Jefferson comes across as being a lot more carefree in this one. But interesting parallel that I'm going to talk about later on. We're also introduced physically to John Madison in the flesh. He and Jefferson are apparently good friends. are apparently good friends, and Madison has had to deal with Hamilton and a lot of his antics. Namely, overshadowing Madison by writing almost twice as many essays as him when writing the Federalist Papers. You might have remembered that from Non-Stop. Anyway, we get to see the start of Hamilton and Jefferson's rivalry during the song when they first meet. Instead of singing along with the melody of What Did I Miss, like George Washington does, Hamilton sings to the tune of his own song, the musical motif he always uses for introductions, which creates a bit of dissonance with Jefferson's own melody, signaling the clash between their personalities and policies. These two are like... well, actually no, I'll talk about it later. On stage, Jefferson is reaching out to shake Washington's hand, but Alexander Hamilton cuts Jefferson off to introduce himself. Already starting off on the wrong foot, but hey, at least Hamilton's trying this time. So next, we get introduced to Cabinet Battle number 1, which is something that you would probably... well, it's giving us a little bit of a taste on what goes on in the cabinet during this time. There's a really interesting choice, in this musical was turning political debates into rap battles, which is what Cabinet Battle number 1 and number 2 basically are. Which, in some ways, they kind of were like rap battles when Hamilton and Jefferson clashed. They're both extremely smart individuals and also extremely braggadocious. So I would imagine their debates would be much like this. Anyway, the issue is shown in this cabinet battle is Hamilton's financial plan to assume state debt and set up a national bank. Jefferson is against it because he believes all states should be accountable for their own affairs. Now, Jefferson brings up, well, one point that he brings up is, if New York is in debt, why should Virginia have to pay for it? Because it's like, hey, our taxes are all paid, so why are you punishing us for that? Anyway, the following debate involves a lot of legit arguments combined with personal attacks and roasts, though Hamilton goes a bit too far with them. Now, Lin-Manuel Miranda actually had mentioned that this is actually an extremely high-stakes battle. In hindsight, we all know, well, basically anyone who did American history during this time knows that Hamilton eventually got his plan through. But that obviously wasn't a guarantee. During this time, Hamilton's proposed plan was actually outrageous for a lot of people, particularly Jefferson, because it was a plan that was made by one guy who was already kind of controversial because he was like, hey, you know, maybe we should run things the way Britain does in some ways. But he also took models of economic plans from British and Greek one, ancient Greek as well. So it was a very unusual, unconventional plan that people weren't on board with at first. We also see in this song one of Hamilton's biggest flaws holding him back. He's uncompromising. The thing is, in politics, I said that I wasn't going to talk about politics, but in politics, you need to be able to convince others of your ideas, which Hamilton isn't really used to. He's more used to stating his own opinions and basically just let people think what they think about them, but he's like, I'm right, which, you know, obviously doesn't go over too well when you're trying to convince someone who doesn't already agree with you. But it doesn't matter if you believe in your ideals if nobody else in the cabinet agrees with you, because as Washington says, they need the votes. he needs the votes. And this is probably the point, a good point, where I should talk about what the political scene during this time was. So, anyone who has been exposed to American politics in modern times will probably know of the deals with two different parties. You have the Democrats and the Republicans. The idea is that it's like there's a spectrum of political alignment, and it's like basically the Democratic Party is meant to be the left-wing party, and the Republican is meant to be the right-wing party. Now, during the times of Hamilton, neither of these parties technically existed. Instead, we had the Federalists, which people like Hamilton and John Adams were part of, and we have the Democratic Republicans, which had people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in them. The difference between the two: the Federalists appealed to merchants, wealthy and educated, and city folk. The Democratic Republicans appealed to farmers, and they favored the South and West, where things were more, where it was like the more rural areas. The Federalists believed in a strong government over states, a loose interpretation of the Constitution, like implied powers, while the Democratic Republicans believed in states' rights over a national government, which was why Jefferson was so against the idea of a national bank, and a strict depiction, a strict definition, a strict application of the Constitution. The Federalists supported a national bank, while the Democratic Republicans were against them. The Federalists supported excise tax, while Democratic Republicans were against them. The Federalists believed in that the national debt was good for the country. Democratic Republicans didn't. The Federalists believed in a national government to assume state debts. Democratic Republicans believed that states should pay for their own debts. And Federalists believed tariffs should be high. Democratic Republicans believed that they should be low. Federalists favored the British as far as foreign affairs, which is a bit ironic. Democratic Republicans they favored the French more, and they supported the French Revolution. So, part of the reason why Jefferson and Hamilton were so against each other a lot of the time is because they were so, like, they were on opposite sides, pretty much. They believed in very, very different things, and both of them were very unapologetically outspoken. I don't know which one would be left-wing or right-wing if we were applying them to modern days, but that's kind of the way things were in that time. Anyway, as we move on, we then get, well, we see that Hamilton and Jefferson were two sides of the same coin, basically, as much as neither of them would want to admit it. Both were very eccentric and outspoken, refusing to buckle to opposition. However, there were some differences. Hamilton came from squalor. He was born in squalor. As Alexander Hamilton the Son mentions, he was a son of a whore and a Scotsman. Meanwhile, well, his father left when he was extremely young. A hurricane devastated his home in the Caribbean, and his mother died when he was very young as well. Whereas Thomas Jefferson was born into wealth. He had, his family had their own home. I believe he actually was the the son of some, like, slave owners or something like that. Or a planter, like planters. He was the son of a planter who obviously would have been very rich, and so Jefferson was kind of born into wealth, which kind of shows some of the differences between them. Jefferson definitely believes that he is better than other people, and maybe his born into wealth thing might have had something to do with it, whereas Hamilton is very, I suppose, like he'll very aggressively fight for what he believes in, for what he wants, and that kind of stuff, which tends to be a characteristic of someone who doesn't have a lot and they want more. And then especially once they get more, they want to make sure that they keep it. It's actually kind of interesting. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, for those of you who didn't know, was actually, like, he had, one of the themes that he had applied in Lord of the Rings was that people who are the truly dangerous people in the world aren't actually the people who already have power. It's the people who don't have power and would be willing to do anything to get it. Which I reckon is kind of interesting. I might actually talk, because there is a topic that I actually would find rather interesting to talk about that has that application to it. But that's for another time. Next up, we have a very different song. We have Take a Break. We are introduced to a young Philip Hamilton. Remember him? Good old Hamilton's son. Anyway, he's learning piano and French at the same time. And he also has a really cute rap. He then gives a really cute rap to his father while Eliza beatboxes. But before I can really go to in-depth on how cute this is, we want to talk about the whole piano thing with Eliza, because it actually is kind of important. So while they're playing piano and doing their scales in French, Philip insists on improvising, singing a contrasting harmony instead of echoing his mother's melody. His insistence on changing the melody indicates his inheritance of his father's rebellious nature. Now, what I mean by this is that Eliza, I think it's like... So I think it's like, once she gets to 5, she goes up to 5, and then I thought I had turned the charger on. Anyway, she starts going up until she gets to 5, and then she starts going back down. So she ends up in the same note that she started off at. So this kind of shows Eliza's personality of, she likes to play it safe, she wants to make sure that everyone's safe, so she's willing to, like, step down. She's willing to step down once it gets, like, too far. She doesn't want to overextend herself, and she wants to stay safe. She wants to play it safe. Whereas Philip wants to obviously go beyond that. He has very high aspirations, he's very ambitious, and this is shown by the fact that he goes up to 5, but instead of going down like his mother, he keeps going up. So I think it's like he goes up a whole octave? Anyway, it's basically he just keeps going up until he gets to, like, I think it was like 9 or 10 or something like that. Which shows how he's ambitious, he wants to rise up, he wants to soar above others. Which I reckon is a really nice way of showing, a very subtle way of showing musically how different these two characters are. And it does matter, eventually. Anyway, so a bit of music theory to kind of show this more. Eliza and Philip start singing an E major arpeggio form. By the way, I'm quoting this. This is not my own words. Anyway, so Eliza and Philip start singing an E major arpeggio form, but Philip changed the line by switching to E minor in the second instance of Set Wheat Neuf. The way Philip refuses to switch back to E major symbolizes the stubbornness and persistence that he inherited from his father. The last time Philip sings the entire scale, he sings it entirely in E minor, creating a somewhat dissonant tone when melded with Eliza's continuous E major. They sing through the entire scale, each in their own keys, symbolizing Eliza conceding to the Hamilton nature of inflexibility. Anyway, while this is all happening, Hamilton writes to Angelica and actually references Macbeth. So, here's the thing. When I said that Alexander Hamilton spoiling the entire story for you was like a Shakespearean trope, I swear I did not remember this Macbeth reference being in there. That was a total coincidence, but that actually is really neat. It's really neat how he makes a Shakespearean reference when he basically does the same thing that Shakespeare does. He makes this reference by stating tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, implying that something in his domestic life is dying. But what? It's also to draw parallels between himself and Macbeth, two prominent figures who were willing to go to great lengths to achieve power and prosperity. Hamilton then goes further with this by saying Madison is Banquo. Banquo was Macbeth's loyal lieutenant who later opposed Macbeth's claim to the throne, and the throne he gained by regicide, and was killed by the newly minted tyrant. Madison was Hamilton's ally in writing the Federalist Papers and lobbying for the new federal government and the Constitution. Madison wrote the most essays besides Hamilton himself, and is widely considered the father of the Constitution. However, afterwards, Madison split with Hamilton and his Federalists to found the Democratic Republicans, out of fear of the tyranny that could result from an unrestricted federal government, which, to be fair, Madison was kind of right to be worried. Anyway, Jefferson's Macduff. Macduff arrives in the play after Macbeth has already made his grab for power. He opposes the new tyrant and eventually overthrows him. I wonder if he'll do that. I wonder if that's going to happen in this one. Similarly, Thomas Jefferson only returned from France after Hamilton had influenced the Constitution to include more powers for the central government, and was here trying to oppose the putative economic tyranny of Hamilton's debt plan. So now, we get to the adorable Philip rap to Hamilton while Eliza beatboxes. To quote Genius Lyrics, of course the supportive and nurturing Eliza is a beatboxer. In fact, the script itself acknowledges Eliza's beatboxing as it relates to her willingness to give emotional support. The script's stage direction at this point says Eliza beatboxes maternally, which I know if I got a stage direction that said that, I would be like, so how exactly does one beatbox maternally? But Eliza managed to pull it off. Her skill for accompaniment is also quite telling when compared to her sister Angelica's rap solos. So what's the reason behind this? Eliza wants Hamilton to take a break, and they can all go upstate to her father's place, but Hamilton insists on finishing his work. Angelica also notes when they're writing to each other how Hamilton added an extra comma in My Dearest. Angelica... let me try that sentence again. Angelica notes how Hamilton added an extra comma in My Dearest Angelica, which changed the meaning from a standard formality that you use even if you don't really like the person that much, to saying, you are the dearest thing in my world. although historically it was Angelica who actually added this extra comma, and Hamilton called her out on it instead. But, yeah, creative license. Angelica comes and joins the Hamiltons to visit. Peggy ain't here. Why? Because at this time she would have been very sick. Not dead, but sick. The sisters try to convince Hamilton, but he won't budge, which is shown musically by the two sides kind of clashing with each other. In the end, the sisters realize that they won't be able to convince Hamilton otherwise, so they just go upstate without him. So Hamilton is left on his own at home to finish his work. I wonder if that's going to cause any problems. Well, I guess we'll find out in the next song, Say No to This. We are introduced to Mariah Reynolds. I'm going to actually quickly find out how you're actually meant to pronounce this name, because I'm not actually sure whether it's meant to be Maria or Mariah. Hold up a second. Okay, so the American pronunciation, what is it?
Maria Reynolds.
Maria Reynolds. Okay, I don't know why I thought it was Mariah. Okay, we're introduced to Maria Reynolds. Who's she? Well, she's pretty influential. Hamilton is left stressed, he hasn't slept in a week, and he mentions Angelica before his own wife. Maria Reynolds comes through the door and says that she knows he's an honorable man and she needs help. So, he gives her $30, which is about $700 to $800 in those times. Not exactly chicken feed. He also offers to walk her home. That's pretty nice of him. While this happens, Maria kills him with flattery. When Maria says, "This one's mine, sir," in reference to, like, this is my house here, she says, "This one's mine." And she echoes Eliza's line, "Yo, this one's mine," in Helpless. Hamilton goes to leave, but Maria pulls an aha and is basically like, "Take me on," without the on. The ensemble then, during the chorus, represents Hamilton's conscience. Say no to this. Go, go, go. And you know what? They probably represent the audience's thoughts as well. Because I think everyone in the audience at that point was just like, "Bitch, leave!" Anyway, long story short, he doesn't say no to this, and it's not even the last time he does this. He gets a message from a Mr. James Reynolds saying that he knows of the affair that's going on, and so now he's gonna blackmail him. Sounds like a nice young man. Hamilton is allegedly ruined, but he continues with the affair anyway because he's not thinking with his big brain. He's thinking too much about how much bass he plays. If you understand that reference, you are a king of culture, or a queen of culture. Next up, we get to the room where it happens. Hamilton and Burr meet up with each other again and have a friendly discussion, cracking a joke about how someone who fought during the war got a street named after him and all he had to do was die. They ought to give that a try sometime. Dying seems to be a lot less work. Why not they give it a try? Hamilton states to Burr that to get his plan on the Congress floor, he's finally going to have to adopt the Burr approach. Talk less, smile more. Quite the character shift, I would say. And even Burr is surprised by this statement. The line where Hamilton interrupts Burr to say that decisions are happening over dinner reflects how Hamilton and Burr's relationship has changed throughout their lives and the musical. In Aaron Burr, Sir, Burr gave Hamilton the advice to talk less, smile more, to which Hamilton had no response. Their role reversal has progressed throughout the course of the musical, as evidenced by the line in Wait For It that mentions Burr's parents giving him a legacy to protect. It's now Hamilton that has a legacy to protect and everything to lose, meaning that he can no longer afford to mouth off, so he chooses to emulate Burr. This all comes to a peak in the line where Hamilton cuts Burr off when he's like, wait, no, don't go, or something. It shows that this time Hamilton has the upper hand and the higher status, which I think is actually the first time that this happens in the entire musical. Every time before that, Burr has either been, like, above Hamilton as far as status, or they've been on, like, roughly the same level. Anyway, he starts addressing the audience directly. He mentions how Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison walk into a room for dinner, and when they came out, they had somehow reached a compromise, despite Hamilton and Jefferson's reputations as uncompromising individuals. The scary thing is that, as the name of the song states, nobody else was there when that happened, which is what actually happened then. We have no idea how this compromise was reached and what was said, but whatever was said, they were all happy with the result. Hamilton and Madison never mentioned what had actually happened, so we only have Jefferson's word to go by, which is hardly reliable considering that, he paints Madison as being the only one who hated Hamilton, even though we all know Jefferson was always much more disdainful towards him. Anyway, what did they walk away from this compromise with? Well, Hamilton gained unprecedented financial power, so he could actually get his plan off the ground, while the Virginians got the country's capital, which was previously New York. Burr condemns Hamilton's actions, or rather, he condemns a manifestation of Hamilton, like a version that that kind of says what Burr imagines Hamilton would have said, but he doesn't actually speak to Hamilton physically. So anyway, Burr condemns Hamilton's actions, but then realizes that he gave the capital to the Virginians so freely because it doesn't actually matter where the capital is placed, because with his plan, he still owns the banks. As Burr says, he got more than he gave. Now, Hamilton has become manipulative, calculating, and cunning. For the first time in his life, he is hiding his intentions and beliefs, and he has secret ulterior motives. Burr calls Madison and Jefferson merciless earlier in the song, although at this point, the most merciless character would be Hamilton. From Burr's perspective, keep in mind. This is all from Burr's perspective. Hamilton is saying that no matter what other people think of your decisions, it's worth it as long as you come away with something. A less morally upstanding perspective to what he had before. Burr, who's not yet accustomed to the underhanded and dark customs of politics, is still waiting for the golden opportunity to make his move and leave his legacy. Hamilton simply works with whatever he can get and twists it to his advantage, which often gives him the edge over Burr. Not always, because as I'd mentioned before, Hamilton mentioned himself that Burr was a better lawyer than him. Everyone else has been shaping the laws of the country according to their ideals and what they want, but in order for Burr to be in that same situation, he needs to work out what he actually wants if he wants to make an impact. And this is where we find the room where it happens is Burr's I Want song. The song that a main character sings about what they actually want in life. We finally get Burr's I Want song when the play is already well into Act 2, perfectly encapsulating his slithering sense of diplomatic evasion in musical form. Burr reveals that what he really wants in life is to ascend into the upper echelons of politics, to get the glory and consequence of being a person in the room where it happens. So basically, like, he wants to have the power to make decisions that have global and historical impact. However, unlike Hamilton, he possesses no strong beliefs or motivating factors that propel him in this ambition. This glorification of blind ambition cements Burr pretty firmly into his antagonist role, and indeed narratively, this is the song that starts him on the path of direct confrontation, which I'll elaborate on in the next song, Schuyler Defeated. Now this is a rather short song, and I know for a fact that, well, because the song starts off the same way as Schuyler Sisters does, a lot of people when they first hear this song, they think it's Schuyler Sisters, and I have had some friends who actually kind of hate this song because they listen to, like, the opening, like, and they're like, oh yeah, Schuyler Sisters, and then instead we get, like, Philip being like, look, Pops is in the paper, or whatever it is he says, and everyone's like, no, come on. I personally don't mind. I mean, musically, it's nothing really different to Schuyler Sisters, but it is very important narratively, so that's kind of the payoff, or the way up. Anyway, in Schuyler Defeated, Philip and Eliza see in the paper that Philip Schuyler... for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to call him Philip Schuyler Sr., Eliza's father and Philip's grandfather. I know that you're only supposed to use senior and junior if it's like the father and son, but this just makes it simpler. Anyway, so Philip Schuyler Sr. lost his seat in the Senate to Aaron Burr. Historically, this takes place 1 year after the room where it happens, so Aaron's been moving fast. Like 1 year after he's decided he wants to be in the room where it happens, he's already gotten a seat in the Senate. Also, this is the first song... Anyway, actually, wait, beforehand. Philip Jr. is like, oh, dang, like, you know, Dad's gonna be so upset about this. And then Eliza's just like, oh, I'm sure he already knows. And then you just hear Hamilton just being like... Anyway, this is the first song, as well, where Hamilton addresses Burr as just Burr, rather than Burr, Sir, showing an increased animosity between the two. Oh. Hamilton confronts Burr about this and expresses confusion over how he got a seat on the Senate at all when nobody knows anything about him, to which Burr states that people don't really need to know anything about him, they just hate Hamilton. Burr states that the two of them can still be friends, even though it doesn't really get any better from here, unfortunately. Even though you could say that Hamilton is being hypocritical here because he changed his morals by using Burr's philosophy and reaching a compromise, he didn't actually sacrifice his principles to do that. While Burr casually just switching sides to the Democratic Republicans implies that he has no principles to begin with. Anyway, Hamilton's not happy with Burr, but Burr doesn't care because he's finally in the room where it happens. And what's the first thing that Burr does in the room where it happens? He watches Cabinet Battle number 2! Yeah, boy! The issue on the table here, it's another Hamilton versus Jefferson blockbuster sensation here. We're in for a brilliant show tonight, ladies and gentlemen. France is having a revolution! Like, the one that happened, The one that involved Marie Antoinette and let them eat cake. That one. I gotta be more specific with French revolutions. Anyway, and they're debating whether to send American aid to France, since they signed a treaty to do so when the time came. Washington's the only one that needs to be convinced, as it's up to him. Jefferson obviously is on the side of aiding France to repay their debts, while Hamilton believes that America right now is too fragile to start another war, and he sees it leading to an endless cycle of wars if they keep getting involved, which is something that Hamilton expressed worry over during my shot. Now, this battle doesn't last as long as the first one, and Washington ends up agreeing with Hamilton rather quickly, leading to America signing a declaration of neutrality. Now, you might think that's kind of a dick move on Hamilton's part, especially because Hamilton said himself that he said to Lafayette that they would be there when they needed American help. But to be fair to Hamilton, they were still kind of recovering from their own war, and it would have been a bit too soon for them to get involved in another war. But Jefferson doesn't really take the loss well, even bringing up Lafayette again. Hamilton says, or asking if he forgot about Lafayette. Hamilton says that Lafayette's smart, so he'll be fine. Jefferson ends the argument by saying that Hamilton would be nothing without Washington in his pocket. This leads to some resentment shown in Washington on Your Side. This one's quite the slapper. Burr, Jefferson, and Madison start trying to figure out how to bring Hamilton down. They assume that he's using government money to fund his own hedonistic habits. This is the moment where Burr, although he had never truly supported Hamilton, this is the point where he starts working actively against him by provoking his known enemies into taking action against Hamilton. The staging makes this even clearer. Burr is slyly looking over his shoulder at Jefferson on an otherwise empty stage as he says it must be nice to have Washington on your side. This song brings into stark relief one of the main themes of the musical. Washington's unassailable position as the father or the leader of the country, as he was unanimously elected in 1789 and then re-elected in 1792, is a double-edged sword. For younger men of ambition like Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and even Burr, Washington's prestige is both a source of idealization, since they all admire him, and frustration, which we see with Washington picking Hamilton over Burr during Right Hand Man, the cabinet battles, how Washington usually sided with Hamilton. Even Hamilton himself gets annoyed with it whenever Washington calls him son. It's worth mentioning that even though Washington was never, he had made it a point that he wasn't part of any party because he was very anti-partisan to begin with. He would be very ashamed of how America right now is basically just two parties. But it was stated that if Washington were to be one of the two parties that were kind of forming during this time, he would probably lean more Federalist, which is why he usually was more on Hamilton's side. Anyway, the whole deal of George being a father is it contributes to a kind of sibling rivalry. Hamilton is the favorite son, and this song, the other three, sing about their jealousy. Despite being vigorously anti-partisan, Washington's Federalist leanings contributed to the growing resentment and decisiveness among his advisors, since they believed that Washington had chosen a side. They believed that they must move against him to act in their own interests. Hamilton's tenure as Treasury Secretary was the beginning of political factions. At the signing of the Constitution, everyone was a Federalist. They supported the redesign of the federal government outlined in that document and in the Federalist Papers. However, after that overall goal was agreed upon, everyone was no longer united over what exactly a federal government should entail. Those that supported the continuing consolidation of power in the federal government continued to call themselves Federalists and rallied under Hamilton's vision. Those that balked at this centralization of power began to huddle under the umbrella of anti-federalists, held up by Hamilton's former Federalist Papers co-author James Madison. Once Hamilton started arguing to develop a financial sector and fund the debt and create a bank, factions splintered further. Under the leader of Thomas Jefferson, the Anti-Federalists were rechristened to Republicans, later Democratic Republicans. So I guess actually Republicans did exist during this time. All of the founders wanted to avoid creating factions, and they often warned about factionalism in dire terms. The fact that they ended up occurring anyway kind of shows how parties just form naturally, since realistically, nobody's going to agree on everything. Like, I mean, you can look at this even nowadays, you know? Some people like pineapple on pizza, and other people have no taste. Anyway, at this point, Burr and the Virginians joined together against a common enemy. Enemy of my enemy is my friend and all of that stuff. As shown by how they're all singing in unison by the end of the song. Jefferson realizes that if Washington's gonna keep playing favorites rather than listening to experts, at least as far as he's concerned, then he needs to end the cycle by breaking it, which leads to his actions in the next song. What are those actions? Well, in One Last Time, Washington calls in Hamilton to discuss how Jefferson has surprisingly resigned from his position. Hamilton is fully ready to go on a slam campaign against Jefferson, but Washington states how Jefferson stepped down to run for president, which Hamilton states would be impossible to win against Washington, who had actually won the popularity vote by 100%. Washington was super popular at this time. Literally everyone wanted him to be the leader. He probably would have served until he died if he wanted to. But this is what the song's all about, after all. Washington is stepping down from president. This was shocking for Hamilton. The guy who's usually 10 steps ahead of everyone else, not even he saw this coming. Washington's retirement set a precedent of presidents serving for 2 terms only, surprisingly enough. This was only broken in 1940 by Franklin D. Roosevelt, who died during his 4th term after serving for 12 years and 39 days. Despite, or perhaps because of, this successful exception to the unwritten rule, a constitutional amendment was finally passed to enshrine the 2-term convention into law. Now, why was this such an important thing? Because as far as Washington was concerned, a leader that is allowed to lead until the day they die is like perfect grounds for a tyrant. Someone who has like absolute power, can't be overthrown, and it's not like you can even outlast their power. As far as Washington was concerned, 2 terms lasting 4 years per term is the longest that someone should go for. Washington also started the still running tradition of a farewell address from all outgoing American presidents, teaching them how to say goodbye. The farewell address has become a chance for presidents, no longer worried about political pursuits, to speak their mind about their time in office. Which I think is quite important, quite nice. I reckon it would be quite cathartic for anyone who's in that position. Certainly not gonna be me. I'm never gonna be president. It's worth restating how incredible of a position this was, how incredible of a decision this was for Washington. Throughout his whole life, he has rejected power as often as possible, only becoming president because he was basically forced to. He was the most powerful man in America, and he turned it down after serving for 8 years to prevent America from becoming a dictatorship. Now, Hamilton had a different perspective. He believed that an elected official should serve as long as they can, since the longer they serve for, the better they'll get at the job. Now, the thing is, I think a lot of Commonwealth countries follow that doctrine now. In basically any country that has a prime minister, it's like the prime minister's the most powerful person in the country, except not really. But it's like they're the equivalent of a president, and they basically can serve like for as long as they want to, as long as they just like keep getting re-elected, which is different from how America does it, which is like a president can only ever serve a maximum of 8 years, no more. But this is a beautiful example of the differences in character between these two men. Hamilton prefers bold acts of bravery and perseverance to prove strength, whereas Washington is more political and sees how the real strength can be demonstrated by stepping back. It's also a beautiful example of their difference in views, and of Hamilton's deep respect for Washington. Hamilton's worried that the people might think Washington is weak if he resigns. The focus of this comment is Washington. In stark contrast, Washington's reply shifts the focus onto the people. His answer implies that the people will see that they, the country with his newly found freedom and independence, are strong, even without him at the helm. Another reason why Washington wanted to step down so adamantly was because he feared that the country might die with him if he continued to serve until he died. By stepping down, the country can move on and then outlive him. So then we get to a part where Hamilton reads out Washington's farewell address. And while Hamilton's reading this, the strings are playing the melody to Story of Tonight under it, with a very similar meaning behind it. It's a moment of optimism, for Washington at least. A moment earned after many years, decades even, of fighting for a better future, and Washington can finally be at peace and enjoy his success after so long. The line, George Washington's coming home, is similar to Jefferson's homecoming in What Did I Miss?, where in Jefferson's case it was an excited welcoming. In Washington's case, it's a bittersweet farewell. Not to mention, he's not just going to retire, he's going there to die, since he actually died only a year and a half after resigning, so it's kind of Washington's homegoing as well. So, since we're speaking about Georges, let's move on to the other George in this show. I know him. This is the final song with King George in it. In this song, he hears that Washington has resigned from his position, and King George is très surprised by this. He hears that John Adams will be replacing him and states how Adams is a much weaker man, that the American people will eat him alive. So, clearly King George is thinking, this should be fun. And so after this song, King George sits down on a chair to the side of the stage to watch everything go down. So yeah, Washington has stepped down and has been replaced by John Adams, who, if you remember, I had mentioned before, was a Federalist, much like Hamilton. So what does he do with his presidency? Well, we find out in the Adams administration. Adams is the new president and Jefferson was the runner-up, which makes him the vice president by default. Jefferson's happy about this because he now has more power than Hamilton and Washington can't help him anymore. Adams ends up firing Hamilton and then talks shit about him behind his back. So what does Hamilton do? He writes a massive encyclopedia-sized book and drops it like a bomb. Basically, Hamilton's entire response to Adams's theme. He eviscerates Adams. This is actually the only song that has a censor bleep in it as well. Why? Because Adams supported the Alien and Sedition Act, which criminalized criticism against the government. Also because it's funny. Madison and Burr are at first happy with this, since Hamilton now has no political power, and he just destroyed John Adams, the only other significant member of his party, as they say. Jefferson, however, is not quite as optimistic. He mentions how Hamilton remains a threat as long as he can write. They decide then to confront him about their thoughts that he is embezzling government money to fund for his shallow lifestyle. So we move on to the song we know. Burr, Jefferson, and Madison all confront Hamilton, and he immediately can tell something's up. The three tell Hamilton that they know he's been sending money to a James Reynolds, saying that he's taking the money out of the treasury. Hamilton still insists on being the smartest in the room, being like, you thought you could ruin me, but nah, I'll just give you something potentially even worse that you weren't even accusing me of to clear my name. What about that? Anyway, in order to defend his reputation and himself from the law, he gave these three guys, who would live to ruin him, the letters that prove his affair with Maria Reynolds. This is an example of Hamilton defending his reputation rather than his family. He doesn't want these three to learn about his affair, fearing they would use it against him, so he decides to use it against himself. Also, I like Jefferson's reaction to finding out about the affair. It's like, it's like in the pockets of people with me down on their luck. You see, that was my wife. You decided to... What? But I tell you what, I think it would have been funnier if he was just like, Quoi? Because, like, hear me out on this, alright? It works for his character, considering his close relationship with the French, and because Quoi is objectively a funnier way of saying what than what. Don't believe me? Check out my episode on this. I determined which languages have the funniest whats. And I won't spoil it for you, but I will say that Quoi is objectively better. Anyway, Hamilton claims to have not committed treason and sullied his good name, even though he admitted to adultery, which would probably still sully his good name regardless, and he still technically committed treason, not towards his country, but his wife. The three say that the people won't know what they know, but Hamilton is not 100% sure about this. He asks Burr specifically how he knows he won't use it against him. Burr gives a very ambiguous answer, dodging his question by saying that rumors only grow, and we both know what we know. Notice how Burr did not make any promises here. So next we get to hurricane. So straight after Hamilton has just been confronted by Burr, Jefferson, and Madison, he realizes that things are probably going to be going downhill from here. He notes how in the eye of a hurricane there's quiet. Interesting to note, considering hurricanes have been his makers and breakers in life. A hurricane did destroy his family town, after all. There's a very symbolic aspect of the song Hurricane being here, of all places. In Non-Stop, we see Hamilton as the storm itself. He's working, flying through government ranks, and at the very height of his prowess in the musical. He's written the Federalist Papers, influenced the Constitution, and had a say in its making, and earned his place behind President Washington in his cabinet as Secretary of Treasury. Hamilton faces the eye wall, the eye wall in the series of songs between One Last Time and We Know. The eye wall, the most violent part of the storm, can equate to the accusations of extortion and the loss of Washington's support in the political sphere. Washington acted as a shield to many of Hamilton's critics. After all, who would dare insult the nation's leader and liberator by attacking his partner Hamilton? Devoid of the former president's protection, Hamilton is slammed by the press and Adams in the Adams administration, and loses a good chunk of supporters. The charge of extortion in We Know is the last straw before Hamilton thrusts himself into the safe space of the eye of the hurricane. Which brings us to this song, Hurricane. Hamilton has fought through the storm of accusations of extortion from Burr, Jefferson, and Madison, and landed in the eye of the hurricane, a quiet and gentle place when compared to the rest of the storm. It's the place in his mind where he retreats from the influences of others and undergoes some self-reflection. He reviews his life experiences from the beginning and ultimately comes to the decision that destroys him. Being in the eye of the hurricane is only a temporary fix for Hamilton. It's a precarious position, one that's unforgiving if you take one step out of your range. But by the end of this song, he's started moving out from the eye, back into the eye wall. Looking back on his life, Hamilton recalls how he wrote his way out of hell, rode his way to the top, rode his way through every hardship he faced. There hasn't been a single problem he hasn't been able to solve with a pen, so he reasons, why should this one be any different? At this point in time, everyone's moving in slow motion and moving furniture around, creating a mountain for Hamilton to stand on. Everything's spinning around. It's an absolutely stunning visual, let me just say. It is possibly the best visual in the entire show, with one possible exception, which I will get to later on. So, he decides to ride his way out, kill the competition with overwhelming honesty. The poor boy has been through so much, from his parents leaving him, either on purpose or because of death, to a hurricane that destroyed nearly everything. One, he's trying to recreate the miracle that got him out of the hopeless situation that got him to the place in society he's in right now. He's essentially saying, hey, look, I'm so good at writing that I should be excused for cheating on my wife. It's all good. However, this method doesn't work, as the last hurricane he was in wasn't actually his own fault. He used his wit and talent to get out of it. He's trying to use the same strategy to make his way out of the metaphorical hurricane he created. He wrote down honesty both times. First, honesty with his feelings. Second, honesty with the situation. Telling everyone you cheated on your wife won't get you out of your metaphorical hurricane, by the way. And two, He's showing his character off again. He's stubborn. Stubborn beyond belief. Even with everyone on the back of his mind telling him to calm down, to let it go, that his mistakes will be recorded, and that he should just learn when to be patient. The woman he loves, a member of her family which he claimed to care about, the very woman that had put up with the person who turned him into a scandal, and one of the last people he could have called a friend if he tried to fix their relationship, all telling him to just calm down. Even when the rest of the company joins in, he still does nothing. He does nothing to listen to them. He believes his intelligence is superior to them, and therefore doesn't listen to the nagging voices in the back of his head to calm down. Hamilton refuses to listen to them, and he writes the Reynolds pamphlet. A 98-page document that could be considered the first major political sex scandal in American history. Hey, he's making history here. Anyway, in this pamphlet, Hamilton described his amorous connection with Maria Reynolds, with the privity and connivance, which just means like consent and facilitation, of her husband James as a means of extorting Hamilton. Throughout the pamphlet, Hamilton spends considerable time talking about how he didn't steal any money from the US Treasury, even going so far as to suggest Eliza would approve of using their money instead. Why did you have to bring your wife into your affair like that? I know that he was trying to like batter people with honesty, but like, why did he think this was a good idea? By the way, several people were telling Hamilton to just ignore the charges that were being pressed against him since they had no evidence and would ultimately amount to nothing. Hamilton ignored those statements, ignored that advice, believing once again that he knew better, even though this time he really didn't. So during this song, Jefferson starts celebrating that Hamilton's never going to be president now within a hurricane of motion, tossing pamphlets everywhere, making it rain, even giving one to the musical conductor, like they do this every single show. King George even gets involved in it all, while Hamilton is just kind of stunned silent by everything. One of the few times that Hamilton has been speechless over this. In fact, I don't think he really does much speaking in this song at all. Anyway, after this whole hurricane of motion, Angelica comes back with the melody for Satisfied coming in tentatively to make the audience a bit unsure of how Angelica will react. Angelica ends up making it clear, even though Hamilton's happy to see her, she makes it clear that she's not there for Hamilton. She is there for her sister. Even restating that, she knows her sister like she knows her own mind, and you'll never find someone as trusting or as kind. This time it's more of a, you done goofed, son. Anyway, as this is mentioned, by the end of the song, everyone mentions his poor wife. His poor wife, Eliza, who hasn't said anything in this entire song. Why? She would have a lot to say. Well, that's what we get in Burn. Now, this song has the same chord progression as Alexander Hamilton, but with some differences. The bass line is different, and the time signatures are different. Alexander Hamilton is 4/4, which is like most songs' time signatures. Burn is 6/8, a much more unusual tempo. This, quote, this sets up a speaking juxtaposition between the two tracks. The first track has a strong beat, an almost militant certainty in and optimism about Alexander's character, while this track slows and whirls for a more reflective and tragic depiction of doubt and acrimony against him. It's even more upsetting that this change comes from the voice of Hamilton's most ardent supporter. In the song, Eliza starts recalling how Angelica warned her about Hamilton. Throughout the play, Angelica always had a clearer understanding of Hamilton and his motives than Eliza does, mostly because she's a much more similar person to Hamilton than Eliza is. In Satisfied, she knows that part of his attraction to her and Eliza is their position in society, as well as recognizing that marriage alone wouldn't be enough to make him satisfied with his life. However, Angelica does miss the mark with her statement that Hamilton will do what it takes to survive. She was wrong about that. Throughout the rest of the show, as Miranda puts it in his 60 Minutes interview, it's clear that Hamilton was ready to die from the time he was 14 years old. Washington spots it right away. Hamilton doesn't care about his own personal survival. What he cares about is the survival of his reputation and his legacy, which he's determined will outlive him. Eliza's repeated refrain, "stay alive and that would be enough," stands as a sort of rebuke or counterweight, both to Angelica's skepticism and Alexander's own fatalism. Eliza realizes that Hamilton's words flooded her senses almost to the point of worshipping Hamilton, rather than seeing him as an equal in a two-way marriage. She places the whole blame on Hamilton. Like, the blame of the affair, she places all of that on Hamilton. Even though it would have been easier, and still understandable, if she blamed Maria for everything, like Hamilton and James Reynolds seem to do. Eliza, however, refuses to take the easy road and blames Hamilton for everything. Not even the affair so much, but the publication of it all, as she says that the world has no place in our bed. This marks the first time in the show that Eliza actually shows self-agency, rather than having people just let her do things, like be a part of the narrative. Here, she's actively taking action by erasing herself from the narrative, destroying her old letters from him, and declaring that Hamilton is no longer any more than a common nobody to him. Eliza's usage of the word burn also changes throughout the song, with each reiteration of the word. At first, she says that the world seemed to burn around her, as though nothing in the world mattered other than him. She then states that she's burning the letters as she erases herself from the narrative, and finally, she says that she hopes he burns. Since she was a rather religious person, we can guess what she means by that. So, we know Eliza's perspective of it, Hamilton's wife, but what about his son? We find this out in Blow Us All Away, which starts off on a much happier tone to kind of lift us up after Burn just happened, which is a very heavy song. Blow Us All Away starts off a lot cheerier, and we get to see more of Philip Hamilton. Only 19, but his mind is older. Wait, haven't we heard that before? Yeah, we have, Sam! Alexander said the same thing earlier in the show. It looks like Philip's growing up to become just like his father. Man, I tell you what, I look forward to seeing what his future life will give him. Well, let's find out. He's trying to find a lawyer named George Eaker. Are we seriously another George? That's 3 now in this show. Philip wants to find him to confront him about what he said disparaging Hamilton and his legacy. Philip doesn't actually mention the affair at all, so it's kind of possible that he doesn't actually know about what's going on, or he just doesn't believe them, the people who say stuff. Anyway, he also makes a very shameless come-on to 2 women who he asked about where Eaker was. Even more shameless than his father would have done. which is a nice nod to how he's not actually as mature or experienced as he thinks he is. I wonder if that's going to become a problem later on. Philip finds Ika and starts confronting him about what he said about Hamilton. Ika, however, refuses to apologize and even doubles down, calling Philip and his father a scoundrel, which was actually pretty insulting at the time. Basically, a scoundrel is a person with no principles or morals, which was a pretty scathing insult, particularly to someone like the Hamiltons. In fact, Philip is so insulted by this that he challenges Ika to a duel. Oh boy, another duel. Philip goes to tell Hamilton about the duel and says that he reacted the way that he did because apparently he knew that his father would have reacted the same. This shows that Philip models a lot of his behavior on what he believes old Alexander would do. Keyword being old Alexander. As in, like, probably how Hamilton was when, like, Philip was just born. But as we've seen in the previous few songs, Hamilton's kind of had a bit of character direction change. Not so much a full-on 180, but he's definitely changed since the beginning of the story. Surprisingly, we get an interesting character progression by Hamilton simply telling Philip to slow down, as Philip's telling him about this. The man who used to write like he's running out of time is now telling his son to slow down. Philip went to Hamilton to ask for advice since he was never taught about dueling at school. This shows two differences between Alexander and Philip. Alexander grew up poor and alone, but he learned how to fend for himself because he was forced to. Philip's parents gave him every advantage Alexander never had. A loving family, a stable home, an excellent education, but ironically in doing so, they failed to teach him the skills he needed to navigate the world. Kind of a common problem with parenting even today. The second difference is that Philip challenged Ika to a duel despite knowing nothing about it. Hamilton only ever got involved in things he was already experienced and well versed in, or at the very least would learn more about it before brazenly speaking his thoughts, such as politics, war, and law. Philip confidently got involved in something he knows absolutely nothing about, which, as far as I'm concerned, is something that Hamilton would never do. Hamilton asks if Philip's friends attempted to negotiate a peace, showing more maturity than the last duel we saw him get involved in. Philip declares that Ika won't listen. The duel is apparently happening in New Jersey because everything's legal in New Jersey. By the way, not entirely true. Dueling was actually illegal in New Jersey, it just wasn't enforced, which kind of brings up the question of, like, why it was even illegal in the first place. Like, what's the point of banning something if you're not going to actually enforce it? I don't know. But with the whole line of everything's legal in New Jersey, Philip says the line as though he's excited by the loophole, but Hamilton sounds more deadpan annoyed. Alexander then counsels his son to throw away his shot as he was increasingly critical of dueling as a means of settling matters of honor. This breaks the 9th commandment from the 10 duel commandments, which, if you remember, was look him in the eye, aim no higher. He also states that if Ika's truly a man of honor, he'll see Philip with his pistol in the sky and follow suit. I guess we'll find out if Ika's truly a man of honor. Maybe he's a better person than we thought. And unlike the young and brash Hamilton who was so eager to prove himself that he wished for a war, this older Hamilton has a much more nuanced feeling about the act of killing. Hamilton is expressing the view of many veterans who have seen action, that it changes and haunts you forever. Hamilton mentions that Philip's mother also can't take another heartbreak from her son having killed someone. Since the affair and the publication of it, then at this point in time, Peggy Schuyler would have just died. Hamilton was actually with her when she died and sent Eliza a very somber message, a somber letter saying that her sister's suffering was over. He ended the letter with, "Adieu, my sweet angel. Remember the duty of Christian resignation. Ever yours, A.H." He still loved Eliza at that point, even after everything. He then gives Philip his guns and tells him to use them and make him proud. Interestingly, Hamilton's advice is very different to Washington's advice to him in the same situation. Washington was basically just straight up, don't do it, it's not worth it, I don't need saving, I can take whatever mud gets slung at me. Hamilton, meanwhile, doesn't actually tell Philip to back out, but to instead face him like a man, but then throw away his shot at the last second. I guess we'll see which works out better. In greeting Ika, Philip shows the manners of an honourable gentleman, asking him, how the rest of the show went, while Ika refuses to follow suit. Uh-oh, maybe he's not super honourable. Or maybe he's just still a bit annoyed by it all. Also, they skip through the final negotiations that are supposed to take place on site. So, the two of them then walk 10 paces, or at least they were planning to. Ika fired his shot on the count of 7. He didn't even wait till 10. Incredibly dishonorable. Also, interesting note, remember what I said in Take a Break, how Eliza and Philip would do their scales, but then they would always diverge? Eliza would go back down while Philip would keep going up? Yeah, they would always diverge by the time they got to 7. The same count that Ika fires his shot in. So next we get to Stay Alive Reprise. After the events of the duel, Hamilton is seen rushing to the hospital where Philip is being kept, while women sing Stay Alive. Basically what the audience is hoping for as well. The doctor there explains the situation, but that Philip's already lost a lot of blood and the wound was already infected, which was usually what made wounds lethal at the time. Philip lays in the bed, saying that he did everything right, holding his gun to the sky even before it got to 10. This draws parallel to History Has Its Eyes on You, proving that nobody has any control over who lives and who dies. In that song, Washington made every mistake and yet still lived to tell the tale. Philip, meanwhile, did everything just right. Eliza shows up and is obviously distraught by it all, asking if Hamilton knew about it, which, as we know, he did, which is kind of just like twisting the knife a little bit more. Philip apologizes to Eliza for not listening to her. The two recall their piano lessons. The two then start singing in French again, but Philip dies by the time they get to 7. Again. Eliza doesn't actually register it at first, but then screams in anguish. I gotta say, this scream is probably one of the most distraught screams I've heard in a show, film, or theater. It is done incredibly well. It's like props to the Eliza actresses because they nail it like every time. And you wanna know what makes this sadder? This song has a descending bass in it, which a lot of songs in Hamilton had. The first song that had one actually is The Story of Tonight. But this song doesn't actually use that song's descending bass. Instead, it uses Dear Theodosia's. The song that was all about joyful optimism of parenthood and the beginning of a new life is now being used during the end of that very same night. That very same life. We then hear the string accompaniment of the story of tonight briefly before we get into It's Quiet Uptown, the saddest song in the entire show. The descending melody of the song is the exact same one that you hear at the very end of That Would Be Enough. In that song, it was to show the start of a family that could be enough for Hamilton, but now it's being used after that family has been destroyed. This song starts with Angelica singing. Originally, Burr was going to be filling this role instead, but they changed it to Angelica since it was the most satisfying end to her arc. She chose to bear witness to Hamilton and Eliza's lives, and now she's fulfilling that role here, at their lowest point. Angelica mentions the two going through the unimaginable. The way she sings unimaginable is the same way that Eliza's saying helpless in the chorus of Helpless. The unimaginable being that Hamilton and Eliza have both outlived their child. Something that no parent should have to do. They move upstate, and Hamilton mentions how he never liked the quiet, which makes sense considering how he's used to talking non-stop. Hamilton mentions that he prays, something that he had never done before. Hamilton also mentions that Philip probably would have liked the quiet uptown, as if the situation wasn't sad enough already. He keeps drawing up memories of Philip. The chorus tells us that since Alexander's very public fall from grace, the public had been very much against him. With the death of his child, however, people don't really have the heart to hold the affair against him. We call back to a lyric from Dear Theodosia that has a whole new meaning now. That one being, you knock me out, I fall apart. We also see a rarity from Hamilton. Speechlessness, when he says, and I thought I was so smart. He's using other people's words and melodies, struggling to create his own. If you recall, Burr sung that line in Dear Theodosia, not Hamilton. During this time, Eliza is just standing, grief-stricken, saying nothing. Here, Hamilton reprises some of Eliza's words from That Would Be Enough. Look where we are, look at where we started. In that song, Eliza attempted to empathize with her husband's troubled mind and help him think about the future in a new way. This time, it's Hamilton that acknowledges his wife's pain. The frequent use of the inclusive we implies that Hamilton is really trying to bridge the gap between them and remain a team. This is the one time in the show that Hamilton says anything would be enough. He's never been satisfied before, much to Eliza and Angelica's sadness and frustration. But if he could make Eliza happy again, if he could somehow bring Philip back, even if he isn't alive by the end of it, that trumps all of his other grand ambitions. In addition, Hamilton is using Eliza's melody instead of singing to his own tune. He puts the two of them on the same level, showing that he respects her position and is trying to show her he sees the tragedy from her point of view as well as his own. But he's also rendered speechless by the pure grief after Philip's death, saying, I don't pretend to know, which also represents a significant departure for Hamilton. For the first time, his brilliant mind can't comprehend everything that's going on. Even with the traumatic implosion of his political prospects, not Treasury Secretary, never going to be president, good name ruined, Hamilton's thoughts were still buzzing with strategy. Yet now, with his son dead, his famous intelligence has deserted him. He can't see the challenges, let alone write himself out of them. He also admits freely this failure to Eliza. It's an unusual admission of vulnerability for him. one we haven't seen him make to Eliza since he first opened up to her in Helpless. However, he's not afraid to come to her like this, since he knows who he married well enough to trust her with those feelings, despite everything that's come between them since those early days. The two of them walk with each other, sharing their grief. Hamilton asks Eliza if she likes it uptown. Very reminiscent of the line at the beginning of the song, "Philip, you would like it uptown, it's quiet uptown." But instead of dwelling over what he lost, he's looking at what he still has. Ever the optimist. This song also clearly expresses the 5 stages of grief. The first stage, denial, is when you deny your loved ones were ever lost. This commonly happens by talking to yourself, which Hamilton does, according to the song. Next is anger, and Hamilton was very angry. He smacked Ika in the press and fought for better dueling restrictions. Even though this failed, it was worth a shot. Bargaining, the third, is wishing to trade for your loved one. "If I could trade his life for mine" is stated very clearly in the song. After that, the actual depression is pretty much just throughout the entire song. Even James Madison got teary over it. And acceptance is seen here, as he lets go of what he's lost and looks to what he still has. Eliza, hence, why he tries to make it up to her and repair their relationship. Even after their incredible loss, Hamilton recalls to Eliza how lucky they are to be alive right now, calling back to a much more carefree time in the show, also calling back to Non-Stop, when he sings this line as an excuse to leave, but this time it's being used to comfort her and say how lucky he is to have her. Eliza sings her only line in the entire song, "It's quiet uptown," copying what Hamilton said to her to the tune of "That Would Be Enough." She finally has his full, undivided attention after so many years of trying, and for her that's enough. She forgives him, and they continue walking and talking by each other's sides as they go through the unimaginable, working to repair their relationship. So next up, we get quite the departure. The election of 1800. We start off with the same melody that Washington on Your Side has. Jefferson steps in to lift the mood, being the only person in the entire world eager to get back to discussing politics. Although, to be honest, considering what the audience has been going through at this point, I'd say we're probably pretty okay with going back to politics. We get, as mentioned, the same melody in Washington on Your Side, much more cheerful than the last few melodies. John Adams had passed a lot of unpopular laws that made him unpopular with literally everyone. So he's basically out, like he has no chance of winning a second term. So Jefferson's going for president again, with a new opponent, Aaron Burr, with his own faction. He's been openly campaigning and is actually very popular. Mostly because he's considered less extreme and friendlier. Maybe the first time that had happened in American history, but certainly not the last. Jefferson is seen as a Francophile who's too supportive of France, as well as being too elitist. Madison suggests a plan so insane it would never work. Get Hamilton on Jefferson's side. They call back to Washington on your side, but instead of saying it would be nice to have Washington on your side, he says it might be nice to get Hamilton on your side, showing that despite Hamilton's political career being ruined, he's still a very influential figure in politics at this time. But the idea is considered impossible considering that Jefferson has always been Hamilton's biggest rival, whereas Hamilton and Burr have known each other and called each other friends for decades. Granted, their relationship has deteriorated lately, but it's still probably better than Hamilton and Jefferson, who never really liked each other. We get a recurring Burr theme, which we hear in Aaron Burr, Sir, and the room where it happens. The whole talk less, smile more. But here, where Burr is running a successful campaign with the strategy, the tone and melody are different. Urgent and triumphant, but also strident and even manic. His words sound a little forced. His voice nearly cracks at the end of the verse. There's an instability to Burr at this moment. A feeling that he's teetering between a euphoric, yes, this is working, and a crazed, this has got to work. It's also sung in another new musical style for Burr, echoing Burr's tendency to shift his stance depending on what he thinks the situation calls for. This whole section is reminiscent of rock or pop-punk musicals, particularly Spring Awakening. Everyone starts asking Hamilton who he'll be voting for, who is still remarking how quiet it is uptown. He speaks with Burr, and during this conversation, Hamilton asks Burr if there's anything he wouldn't do. But Burr says he's just going after what he wants, no longer waiting for it. He then says that he learned that from Hamilton himself, but he missed Hamilton's point, to fight for your beliefs. Whereas Burr is just chasing what he wants for personal gain. The votes were tied between Jefferson and Burr, and it's up to basically Hamilton to break this tie somehow. So, who does he vote for? Thomas Jefferson. To the shock of everyone, including Jefferson himself and Burr. Like, Jefferson's reaction to this revelation is kind of like, wait, what? Hamilton's actually on my side? Whereas Burr is kind of more thinking like, how dare Hamilton get in my way and stop me from achieving what I want again? So many times he has gotten in my way, and now I have the potential to become the most powerful man in America, and he's getting in my way again. So why exactly did Hamilton vote for Jefferson? Well, the reason is that even though the two have never agreed on anything before, Jefferson actually has beliefs, Burr has none. And because of this position, Jefferson ends up winning in a landslide. Burr's response to the defeat versus Jefferson's response to the defeat really shows and even juxtaposes their personalities. Burr is still standing by his beliefs of talk less, smile more, and is humbly congratulating Jefferson, while Jefferson laughs in his face and tells Burr exactly what he thinks about him. In a way, Jefferson's reaction to Burr emphasizes Burr's lack of audacity when it comes to speaking his mind. Burr states that he looks forward to their partnership, and Jefferson is kinda flabbergasted by this. He's just like, this bitch has just been openly campaigning against me, and now he turns around and is like, I look forward to your partnership. The law states that the runner-up becomes vice president. Jefferson ends up changing that rule because he's the president. Even though Burr did still serve as VP, he was the last runner-up to automatically get that role. So, after this point, coming runner-up didn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteed the VP spot. Afterwards, Jefferson then tells Burr, hey, when you see Hamilton again, thank him for the endorsement. So next we get your obedient servant. We get back to Burr's typical rap verses that we hear at the beginning of Alexander Hamilton, The Winter's Ball, and What Did I Miss? How does a da 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 da? But this time it is much more vicious with Burr's delivery, almost bloodlusted. We get a callback to the room where it happens, but it's slower and more foreboding. He's starting to lose it. Burr writes a letter to Hamilton saying that he is infuriated with Hamilton's statements, challenging him to a duel in writing and signing it off with, "I have the honor to be your obedient servant, A. Burr," taking the piss out of Hamilton. He did actually sign the letters like that, by the way. Hamilton responds by saying that it's Burr's own fault that nobody trusts him, and even if it was true, he would need to provide evidence, then provides Burr with every grievance he's had over Burr, over 30 years or so, which is pretty extensive to say the least. He then says that he doesn't want to fight, but he won't apologize for saying what's right. This is a direct callback to the events leading up to the death of his son. George Eaker wouldn't apologize to Philip Hamilton for what he said about Alexander, and Philip died in that confrontation. He tells Philip to avoid a duel at all costs, but Hamilton doesn't follow his own advice. Here, Alexander doesn't apologize for what he said, directly mirroring Eaker's non-apology, and thus this dispute now merits further action from Burr. He cuts off an avenue of resolution that's been drilled into our heads twice now regarding the rules of dueling, and so leads himself into his final confrontation. Hamilton then signs off his letter by passively aggressively parroting Burr's own passive aggression. Burr doubles down by signing it off with, "I have the honor to be your obedient servant, A. Ham." Burr ends up doubling down on his threat to duel. Hamilton states that Burr has legitimate grievances, but he won't go back on what he said because it's true. So, Burr pulls the ultimatum to duel each other, something that Hamilton seems less eager to do than Burr. We know this because Burr actually says his lines on the beat, whereas Hamilton says it offbeat. He doesn't even say it like on the offbeat. He kind of says it like in between the beats, but not rhythmically. It kind of shows that Burr is a lot more certain about this decision than Hamilton, which is like the first time that's ever happened. So next we get Best of Wives and Best of Women. We get the opening piano melody of It's Quiet Uptown, but in a slightly happier rhythm, showing that things aren't quite as bad as they were before, thankfully. Because far out, to, like, if we had to go back to that sad moment, to, like, sadness in this musical, I don't know if I'd be able to survive. Hamilton is riding a next of kin, according to the 10 duel commandments, and Eliza tells him to go back to sleep. Hamilton insists that he needs to go for a meeting. Eliza asks why Hamilton writes like he's running out of time. It's weird that that gets brought up here. Eliza references that would be enough again, but Hamilton assures her that he'll be back before she knows. Before Eliza goes back to sleep, Hamilton calls her the best of wives and best of women. If you know, you know. Also, fun fact, this is the shortest song in the entire show. It is one of only 2 songs in the entire track listing that goes for less than 1 minute. The other one, hold on, I'm gonna check this out. The other one, so Best of Wives and Best of Women is the shortest, it's the shortest song in the entire musical. And is the only one, or it's one of only 2 that goes for less than a minute. The other one that goes for less than a minute is the Adams administration. It's the shortest song in the entire musical, but it's still very important. So next we get into The World Was Wide Enough. We get the same opening with the 10 Jewel Commandments, but Burr instead states 10 things the audience needs to know. Everybody meets up, Burr, Hamilton, and their number twos, and a Dr. Hamilton knew, who was actually the same doctor who tried to save Philip. Hamilton drew first position and seemed to be surveying the terrain. This entire part is some from Burr's perspective, so we see his perspective on everything, but not Hamilton's. He mentions that anybody would tell you he's a hopeless shot, while Hamilton had a reputation as one of the most accurate shots of his time. This is actually an example of Burr being an unreliable narrator, since his soldiers have said he was actually an excellent shot. Both men also realized they were in the same spot that Hamilton's son died. Burr also mentions that Hamilton was wearing his glasses, and surmises that it must be because he was planning to take deadly aim. The thing is, nobody really knows why he put his glasses on. Like, historically, no one actually knows why. The off-Broadway version mentions Hamilton putting them on to see if Burr's face had softened at all, but we don't really know why he did it in history. Burr is determined to not die in this duel, saying that this man will not make an orphan of his daughter, and the way that Burr, his voice breaks when he says it, it's a really nice touch. It kind of shows more of his desperation. So he's going to do what it takes to survive this duel. They take 10 steps forward, draw, and fire, and then the music cuts out, time freezes, and Hamilton starts engaging in an a cappella rap, showing him rapidly thinking about so many things in less than a second. He imagines death so much it feels more like a memory. He asks if this is where he's going to die. He sees Burr, his first friend, and asks if this will be the last face he'll ever see. He asks if this bullet will be his legacy, before asking what a legacy even is, and he brings up a very eloquent point. A legacy is planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. He thanks America for giving him the chance to make a difference in the world. During this time, we get a bullet slowly approaching him, similar to what happened in Stay Alive. He stands on a soapbox as he monologues, and then the bullet almost hits him before he retreats away from him. He sees those close to him who have already died, Lawrence, Philip, Hamilton's mother, and Washington, asking him to teach him how to say goodbye. For the record, this is the other contender for most visually stunning number in the show. He sees Eliza, calling her his love, and saying that he'll see her on the other side. He raises his gun up into the sky as he says, "Raise a glass to freedom," calling back to the story of tonight. His last line in the entire show, as everything goes back to normal, Burr yells wait, and Hamilton gets shot. Right in the ribs. The significance of the wait from Burr is that the one time he didn't wait for it was the one time he really should have. Burr immediately went to Hamilton to check on him, but he gets forced away. Later on, he finds out that Hamilton had died, with Angelica and Eliza both at his side when he died. Burr is distraught over how Hamilton was the first to die, but Burr has suffered a worse fate. History will now see him as a villain, as the man who killed Alexander Hamilton, who some consider to be the greatest founding father ever. Burr mentions how he should have known the world was wide enough for both of them. And then we get to the final number in the entire song. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? We hear statements from Jefferson and Madison saying that as much as they hate to admit it, Hamilton did so much good for America's economy that he doesn't get enough credit for all he did for America. Jefferson even states that he tried and failed to undo his financial plan. Other than Hamilton, Washington was the only other founding father who died before 80. Hamilton's dead and his reputation is rather low. Who protects his legacy after he's gone? Eliza. Who works to restore his name and make sure his legacy is secured. This completes Eliza's arc, from let me be a part of the narrative in That Would Be Enough, through I'm erasing myself from the narrative in Burn, to this point of fully taking control not only of her narrative, but also of her husband's, and of the plays. She sort of mirrors her late husband, pouring herself into working on a greater cause than to spend too much time grieving. She spends the rest of her life interviewing soldiers who fought with Hamilton, reads all his letters, and consults Angelica while she's still alive. Also worth mentioning, out of the rest of the cast that are alive by the end of the show, Angelica was the next to die after Hamilton, dying 10 years later. She's buried near him. Eliza then starts working on things that she believes her husband would have done, working to abolish slavery, honoring Washington's memory, and publishing Hamilton's writings. She lives another 50 years and states that it's not enough. Here, I think, is something that is, like, so poetic, it kind of makes you think that we're just living out a real-life story. But Eliza outlived everyone else in the show. Like, you look at everybody who's on stage in Hamilton, all of the characters, Eliza was the last to die. She outlived every single other person you see on that stage. I find that very poignant. She no longer wonders if she can be enough, but instead asks if she's done enough. She mentions that her proudest accomplishment was establishing the first private orphanage in New York City. She sees Hamilton's eyes in the children, his eyes no longer making her feel helpless, but instead spurring her into action. At the end of her life, she wonders if she's done enough for Hamilton's legacy, but still can't wait to see him again. At this point on stage, Hamilton appears next to Eliza, much to her happiness and amazement, as if this is the moment of her death. In fact, after the final note fades, the last sound heard is Eliza's gasp, perhaps her last breath, or her joy at her dying vision of Alexander waiting for her, as the theatre goes dark. Or, some have actually said that it's Eliza seeing the audience itself, showing her that Hamilton's story has survived to the point where millions are watching Hamilton's story unfold in this musical. I like this theory. This is kind of the one I go by. But neither Lin-Manuel Miranda nor Philippa Sue, who was the original Eliza, said that they had a set idea on what she gasps at. Philippa said that she kind of just changes the answer every performance. By the end of the show, the title Hamilton refers to Eliza Hamilton as much as Alexander Hamilton. It openly described Alexander's birth, so it's appropriate for it to end with the death of Eliza, the one who told so many of both of their stories. The final lines of the entire musical is who tells your story. Hamilton asks the audience directly who tells your story. Eliza has claimed responsibility for the narrative of Hamilton, but the show acknowledges that stories continue past the people themselves, past just one retelling. Stories come out of the narrative that one builds oneself, out of the choices that one makes, but much of what comes after that is up to others. Hamilton chooses to leave the onus on you, the listener, to put yourself in your own narrative and to cherish the relationships and the people who will take responsibility for your story after you're gone. So that's Hamilton. So, before I finish this whole thing up, I'm gonna go into a bit of an essay here, talking about the morality of the whole thing that they show, what morals this show teaches, because that is what this show was all about, what this series was all about to begin with. And, well, otherwise it's basically just me retelling the story and reviewing it. So, the biggest difference, the biggest moral showcase is the differences between Hamilton and Burr. I think we all know the differences between the two at this point in time. Hamilton is very outgoing, very eccentric. He always speaks his mind, even to a fault, whereas Burr is always very cautious over what he actually says, and he basically never speaks his mind on anything because he knows that somebody is gonna not like what he said. However, their personalities kind of change throughout the show, particularly by the second act. Hamilton starts being a lot more cautious over what he says. He starts hiding his true intentions, at least until the Reynolds pamphlet. But even then, and then he kind of goes back to how he was before, refusing to, like, compromise his morals just to keep people happy. Whereas Burr becomes more like Hamilton. He becomes more proactive rather than like just waiting for the golden opportunity. But he still refuses to share his mind on anything, which is ultimately what leads to his downfall. Also, again, as I had said before, the one time he didn't wait for it is the one time he really should have. Ultimately, Hamilton may have died first, but Burr's reputation was left in more tatters than Hamilton's was by the end of it. The question is, like, whose morality is better? Another difference between the two, between characters, are Hamilton and Jefferson. Both of them are very similar to each other. They're both very outgoing, they're both very outspoken, they're both very unapologetic over their beliefs. But as far as I see, Jefferson is a lot more... He's more idealistic than Hamilton, who is more realistic with his stuff. Also, Hamilton's beliefs were a lot more outlandish even during these times. But I do really believe that Hamilton and Jefferson are like two sides of the same coin. In many, many ways. Like, if they were born in different families, they might have actually switched their personalities and beliefs. Anyway, also in this show, we get the whole concept of legacy, which is basically just the word of the day at this point. I really like how Hamilton describes a legacy in real life. Or by the end of the show, he says a legacy is just like planting seeds in a garden that you'll never get to see. Which I reckon is definitely a good way of describing legacy. it kind of reminds me of a statement that I'd heard. I forget who said it, but I'd heard somebody say that, like, a person dies 3 deaths. The first time is when their heart actually stops beating, and it's like a physical death. The second time is when their body gets lowered into the ground and gets buried. So people kind of, it's kind of like you get brought, like, kind of more at peace after that point. It's kind of like it all hits you. That's the second death. And then the third death is the last time that anyone mentions you. So it's like the last time that somebody mentions you, that is when you die for the third time. And that third time is about legacy. Now, the thing is, depending on what you do in life, your legacy can last for centuries. Like the last time somebody mentions your name, Hamilton's legacy is very intact because we're still saying his name even like 300 years later, almost. And in fact, that reminds me of a quote that Benjamin Franklin said, another founding father who actually, he isn't even mentioned in Hamilton, which is funny because Franklin was a pretty big deal at the time. But he had said, if you want to be remembered for something, either write something worth reading or do something worth writing about. Which is interesting. Now, I get the whole deal of a legacy. It's a very appealing concept, like creating something that'll outlive you. And I mean, I kind of hope at this point this podcast might potentially outlive me. I mean, it should still be around even after I die, so people can still listen to it even after that, right? I don't know, unless something like really huge happens and like, I don't know, YouTube or like podcasts are just erased from history or something like that. I don't know. But whatever. We then get like a difference between work life versus family life. Hamilton was, he definitely valued his work life over his family life. And that got him into a lot of trouble. Like, think about it this way. I reckon if Hamilton decided to actually live, like, if he decided to actually just go upstate with his family that one time, I feel like he probably would have been okay. Like, I feel like his political career would have been pretty alright. And in fact, he might have actually become president at some point. I don't know. Who knows? Could have happened. But, obviously, family life isn't exactly what pays the bills. It is what kind of makes life worth living for a lot of people. Which, as far as I'm concerned, actually would make it more important than work life. Like, I mean, you work to live, you don't live to work. Let's be real here. Anyway, then we have honor versus life, which we get quite a bit, particularly in the first act, where Hamilton is very much like, I want honor, and I don't care if I die for it. And it's like the deal of like, you know, if you give your life for a greater cause, you'll die with honor. Honor was still kind of a pretty big thing in those times. Nowadays, nowadays we kind of have different opinions on what honor actually is. Because, well, we kind of realize that a lot of stuff that people have done for honor is kind of stupid. Like, you know, dying in battle is glorious and that. We've kind of stopped believing that ever since World War One. Or like the idea of like killing yourself to avoid being captured. Um, most people don't really see that as being particularly honorable these days. It's just kind of, yeah, it's just considered rather dumb in a lot of ways. Like, to kill yourself over honor, not, I don't think is very smart. Because it's like, you can redeem yourself. That's a possibility. However, to live without any principles is, well, some would say is worse than death. It's kind of like non-life. You're not really living. Which also actually brings me to principles and how far you go to uphold them. Obviously, having principles is important because it means that you know who you are, what you believe in, and you can go in a direction of life that allows you to uphold those principles. But how far do you go to uphold them? Because Hamilton went so far as to, like, he was straight up willing to die to uphold his principles. Even though, I mean, if he cared about living, if he cared about living more than anything else, the smartest option would be to just apologize, you know? But he had to stick to his guns, he had to hold fast, and he ultimately got killed because of it. The question is, if he did just apologize, would that mean that his principles would be kind of compromised, and would his legacy be kind of compromised? As far as I'm concerned, probably not. But there are no real answers, correct answers to it, unless we end up developing a machine that allows us to travel into alternate universes. But then we also get the grey of historical figures. Nothing is in black and white. Everybody has hints of grey to them. I think one of my favourite aspects of Hamilton as a story is the fact that there is no real villain. Like, Aaron Burr is the closest thing to an antagonist or a villain, but, like, even then, he's not even, like, fully evil because he's a person. Nobody is completely good or completely evil in this story. Everybody has hints of grey to them. Hamilton and Burr, the two most important characters in the entire story, are both, or the two most significant anyway, both of them at their cores are good men, but both of them have made pretty huge mistakes in the past. So yeah, it kind of brings me to the whole deal of, like, even in real life, nobody is completely good or completely evil. Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. So yeah, all of these morals are extremely relevant to modern times since they're universal themes that have persisted and repeated since humanity began. Everyone can relate to these struggles brought up. Like, everyone has at least one character in this story that they relate to. And it might actually be a rather minor character comparatively. I know that I resonate quite a bit with George Washington and Aaron Burr, just as far as the stuff that they've said and what they've done in the story. History does have a tendency to repeat itself, and I've seen similar things in this musical happen in modern times. But the biggest thing that this raises is the creation of things that outlive you and define your legacy. As I had mentioned before about the three deaths, about the three deaths that people deal with, many characters want to live forever by staving off the third death indefinitely. It's the only way to really be immortal, and it's truly the only way I would want to be immortalized, because if I was immortalized by, like, hey, you're immortal, you can't die, I would not want that. I don't want to be immortal in that regard. Like, being unable to die would suck. It would really suck. Anyway, some of you listening may go on to create things and commit actions that will be remembered forever, for better or for worse, but for now, look at where you are and what you have. Remember to be content with what you have, because we do live in the now. So appreciate what's happening for you now. And so, with that in mind, I am going to be signing off. That's basically it. So, with all that in mind, I'll see you guys next week. Hopefully to do a much shorter video than this one. I was not expecting it to go for this long. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed regardless of the length. And until next time, have a good one.